Well, good morning, everybody. I guess just good afternoon just now if you're in Eastern time. And welcome to our webinar for this morning, for this afternoon. I'd like to thank you for taking the time to be with us for a little while. And I'm going to start with a bit of a slow introduction because we're just on time. So people there's still people just coming in. I see number of people joining is jumping up pretty high. So we will just keep going for delay for a couple of minutes while we start to get going. But I do want to thank all of you for taking the time to join me. This is a topic that ArchiMate, the ArchiMate notation and the use of it, that I find tremendously interesting and useful in my work. And I hope that I can bring some of that across in the webinar. There we go. So my name is Brad Brown. I'm an instructor with WebAge Solutions, but I'm also an independent practitioner. Many of the people who are on the delivery side at WebAge are, like me, they're independent practitioners. So we're talking about these are things that we do in our regular life, day to day. It's not just course material. It's actually topics that we are engaged with and use and practice regularly. My role is one where most of what I do is architecture of one form or another, primarily solution and enterprise. But it's a variety of different kinds over time. And that's a particularly good use case for ArchiMate. And I think explains some of the interest that I have in this as a notation and why it's useful. But it may not be really apparent why you might need kind of maybe yet another notation for architecture. But there are situations that probably most of us have been in at one time or another, situations we don't really want to be in, but they happen. And some of these things are reasons why tools like ArchiMate might actually be really useful to us. So I don't know how many people can relate to this, but it's weeks after you've gotten an approval for some project that you've been working on, and you get an urgent email from your business owner. And the business owner says something along the lines of, "You tricked me." Hopefully it's not quite in those terms, but maybe something to that effect. Because their claim is, I didn't know that I was approving that. And I'm sure, this has happened to you. This is kind of not an uncommon thing to happen, unfortunately. And part of the reason that happens sometimes is because we've got kind of somebody really confused and upset because they've been subjected to a lot of diagrams, specialized artifacts. They have a little bit of trouble understanding them. They're not really something that's completely relatable. And that business owner didn't notice something that's really was a critical point. And they might be too overwhelmed by all the detail in these diagrams and various artifacts to know what they don't know. It's really easy to be overwhelmed and not be able to kind of get what some of the important points are and not even know that you've missed them until potentially it's really too late. And that's really a failure of communications. We'll see, maybe we can help with aspects of that. Or another thing that happens, and I'm sure everybody can relate to this, we have all these endless arguments about why a project takes so long. Because from various points of view, maybe from a business point of view, it's kind of a simple request. Why isn't this really easy to do? And the challenge that we have is often people have trouble understanding what the technical impact of some of the things that they're looking for are. Things that they really are simple or they sound simple on the surface might actually be really difficult to do. But how do they understand that? Well, they don't understand that a particular change in one place can lead to changes to processes in a number of other places. Or how much hard it is to take what seems to be a simple process and automate it without the realization that that thing that we think of as a simple process actually has lots and lots of different special cases to it. And what we think of as apparently simple on the surface is actually something that might be really quite complex. And we see this kind of need for some resolution of these issues, even within teams. We might see, for example, our lead developer and our database designer who work in slightly different parts of the world. have a completely different understanding of what the new system is for. And that might result from the difference in perspective and the difference in sense of concerns. Our lead developer might be thinking about the system in terms of what the parts are and their behavior and what it does, whereas a database designer might see the system in terms of the entities it manipulates, the data it manages. Now, we would think, well, those should be complementary views. They should, absolutely. But we can sometimes get into this situation where parts of our team have very different views of what the overall solution is because their specialist views are reinforced by the specialist notations that they work in and that the architecture is delivered in. And often we're hobbled by not really have a good way of describing what the system does for business, what the kind of business side of it is. All of these are signs that indications that we have a communications problem. And that communications problem we may see between architecture and business, between architecture and certain particular stakeholders, even architecture and other parts of the team. And I shouldn't really say between architecture and, because this communications problem, it can be pretty universal. We can have communications challenges between all kinds of different places within a large development initiative. And some of that's just because for some significant initiative, there really is a lot of complexity. There really is a lot of different points of view and a number of different concerns that need to be met. And if that's the kind of problem that you run into from time to time, part of your solution is it's not magic fairy dust, but part of your solution might be a new way of expressing the ideas that you have about an architecture, a new mechanism to communicate. And that's not just about kind of new kinds of diagrams and artifacts that will help people see things better, but it might be in terms of a new notation. And so I want to spend a few minutes just introducing what ArchiMate as a notation is and why it's useful. And then when we've established that, we'll spend just a little bit of time talking about how it actually works to deepen our understanding of why we get benefits from it. So what is ArchiMate? ArchiMate is a notation for describing architectural ideas about enterprise systems. And when I say enterprise systems, what I mean is the kinds of systems and problems that we deal with in kind of typical corporate computing. It's not intended for software engineering. It's not intended for kind of detailed product design. It's really targeted at the kinds of problems that business runs into and business deals with. And not just enterprise applications like an ERP system, really any system that exists and works within a kind of typical business. And part of its secret sauce is ArchiMate deals with things that are traditionally separate domains, business, application, data, and technology. It deals with them with one notation, and it deals with them with one set of artifacts, one kind of diagram. And that gives us the power of being able to bring together a number of different perspectives in one place, to really see the connections between those things. At the same time, ArchiMate is not magic fairy dust that replaces everything. It complements other more specific notations, such as an entity relationship diagram or a business process model notation, or BPMN diagram. So it doesn't replace our toolbox, it adds to our toolbox. It's also important to understand that ArchiMate is not a methodology. It doesn't tell us how to do architecture. It's not a method. It helps us communicate the architecture that we develop. And as such, it doesn't mean that we have to throw away anything that we do now. In fact, we use ArchiMate with our current methodology. It just builds on the capabilities that we already have. As a communications tool, ArchiMate can play a pretty broad role in the architectural activities that we perform. Now, this diagram is a little bit of an oversimplification, but what I want to suggest is the idea that as architects, we may be playing in a number of different levels of scope, all the way from enterprise architecture, which is concerned with the entire enterprise, is very, very broad scope, down to solution architecture, which is about a specific initiative. And even more tightly scoped than that would be design. Now, there's a really fuzzy line between what's architecture was designed. We're not going to get into that debate here. But I want to draw the idea that there's a continuum of levels of detail, levels of abstraction that we commonly deal with. And we're going to be playing up in maybe the enterprise space, the segment space, or the solution space, depending on what kind of thing we're trying to describe and what our role is at the time. And when I say segment, what I mean is a collection of applications or a subset of the business, a number of things that fit together, that work together cooperatively, like components of a supply chain inside an organization, for example, which might consist of things like order management and logistics and warehousing and so on. And the place that ArchiMate can really help with is actually a pretty broad set of different scopes. It can deal with issues way up at the very abstract level, covering the entire business. And it can also deal with issues that are quite detailed in solution architecture. And I can do this with a single set of notations, a single way of describing these concepts, which gives me continuity, it gives me flexibility, and it gives me the ability to reach out and describe the things that I need to at the level of detail that I want. What it doesn't do, and part of the motivation for this diagram, is deal with some of the more detailed, specific, and granular aspects of solution architecture. It doesn't try to do everything. And it really doesn't deal with design issues. So it's not the only notation that we'll use, but it does deal with a very large number of things that, again, are often dealt with specialist notations, or where we don't really have necessarily good tools for describing particular concepts. So let's make this a little bit more concrete and look at a number of different aspects of what we can actually do with ArchiMate. And I'm going to use these as examples to draw out a little bit more about what it can do and start to set the stage for how it works. So let's look at a number of examples. One thing that I find really interesting about ArchiMate and really powerful about what it can do is that I can express not only the architecture that I'm trying to develop, but also why I'm trying to develop it. I could express a strategy, the goals of the organization. This diagram, which is a little bit artificial, it was made up as an example, but it captures the essence of what I'm trying to be able to do with strategy. Lets me actually talk about what my overall objective is. In this particular case, it's the purple box on the top that says 75% first call resolution. Now, if this were a proper deliverable, there'd be text attached to it, some context, and I'd be explaining this is about a call center solution, and it's changing some aspects of how a call center works. But what you can see in the diagram is I can express in my model, I can actually express visually that I have a target to achieve, 75% first call resolution. And how do I achieve that target? Well, I'm going to try and achieve that target with two courses of actions. These are, in ArchiMate terms, strategy elements. They're things that describe the strategy of an initiative or an organization. One of those courses of action is to provide a searchable knowledge base. Yeah, you can't tell from the diagram, but what that means is a searchable knowledge base that supports a call center and call center agents. And another course of action is to provide a 360 view of the customer, because they don't have a consolidated view right now. So I can say this is what my objective is, my target, and this is how I'm going to reach it. The little connectors between them are various ways of showing this is how one part of my overall description, a course of action, say, influences the ability to achieve a target. Now, how do I provide a searchable knowledge base? What do I have to do? Well, that's a pretty abstract idea. All I've really said is that this is the course of action which we intend to pursue. How is that course of action supported or served? Well, by two capabilities. One capability, that's the box with a thing that looks like a kind of pile of dominoes in it, or bricks maybe, is AI-driven search. So I can have a search that's driven by some artificial intelligence algorithms to be more effective as a search mechanism. In ArchiMate terms, that's a capability, a thing that the organization or a system, it's a capability, an ability it possesses, which we don't say how it is possessed, kind of how that happens. We can talk abstractly about a capability which we have or don't have that supports a particular course of action in service of a longer term goal. And if there's a theme here, and I apologize for kind of repeating some of these because I'm developing it in layers, that I can kind of describe the how I would achieve any particular result. I can link all these pieces together. I can link those pieces, which so far are about strategy, how I want to do something, back into particular things like AI-driven search is realized by a business function, the thing with the little chevron sitting on its back, customer support knowledge development. That's a business function. It describes a thing that business does, a function that they perform, and that's the development of knowledge for customer support. And so development of knowledge for customer support realizes some of the capabilities of this AI-driven search. There can be other things as well, but this is one of the things that realizes that capability. And the same thing for the other strategy elements, the other capabilities. A community contribution to a knowledge base is a capability. How does that come about? Because we have a community development business function. And so what you can see is in the strategy viewpoint, I'm able to link where I want to go, how I want to get there, to the particular business functions that will be impacted by that. And not only that, I can connect that to the actual services, the application services, the things that applications will do for me that support those business functions or serve those business functions. Take community development, for example. One of the business services that supports that is content management. Now, that's something that an application does. And so you see, I can link something that an application does through to what business function it supports, kind of what it's used for, right through to the capability that's enabling and the reason why we're pursuing it. And lastly, on this diagram, I show that these different services, application services, the knowledge base and the content management and customer lookup, are all realized by a customer support platform. That's an application. And I can connect together all of the things that drive the development of that application or drive the things it needs to be able to do, right through business function to the motivation, kind of why we did things and what our strategy is. That ability to link from goals all the way down to a particular thing that we're building, a concrete application, can be, it may seem kind of obvious when you see it in a diagram, but it's actually a profoundly powerful thing to be able to express. And look how much I've been able to express in this simple diagram. Now, the diagram is deliberately rather simplified so that it fits on a page. It's just one of the things that I can show with ArchiMate. Now remember, we're staying within the same notation. I'm not kind of moving to another kind of diagram. It's not like I'm in UML where I have a different diagram type for every different thing. Here I'm using the same notation to describe how applications are actually used. Okay, this is a part of a different aspect of the same overall, this is what comes from a sample problem for a course. And here, an application usage diagram lets me see how things that an application does, the services that it provides, are used by business. So here I'm exploring the application usage in the context of a particular business problem. I have a customer support business process to to deliver for customers an estimate of when their orders will be delivered, which in the context of this case there are a whole bunch of issues with why that makes it hard. Now, what this diagram shows is what the applications that are involved are, what services they realize. In other words, what things they're able to do for the users of those applications, and how those things that they can do are actually used. And I can look at this and see that, as somebody goes through this process for estimating the order delivery time, they're interacting with a whole bunch of different application services. And if I follow the connections down to what realizes those services, what are the actual applications, I see that a call center agent is actually switching back and forth between applications, going back and forth from one to another throughout this process. And if you look at this diagram and say, well, that seems kind of absurd. Look at all that extra work they're doing. You'd be absolutely right. But here's the thing that might not be obvious at first. If you don't have some mechanism that lets you see all the applications, all the things they do, and how those things are connected into a business process, if you can't see that in one place, it can actually be really, really hard to understand that this issue even exists, that there's a problem here. Imagine if I had a business process diagram that said, here's our business process. Okay, and maybe it's annotated with connections to some services, but you're largely going to focus on the business process. And then I had some other diagrams that showed what the individual systems did. Maybe I even have some table that says, these are the services that each of the business process steps use. But nothing necessarily pulls that together into one place. And if I don't have all this information in one place, particularly visually, it can be really, really hard to understand that actually these applications, they're real silos. And the fact that they're all silos really gets in the way of an effective and efficient business process. I can't see the silos if all I see are the individual applications and not how they're used. And I can't see the problem if I look at the business process and I can't see how it connects to the applications. And part of the power of this notation is the ability to easily connect things that are happening in the business realm, which are yellow, and things that are happening in the application realm, which are blue. We can connect those things together and actually see that actually there's a significant mismatch between the alignment of what the applications can do and the needs of this particular business process. So if we're able to come to that realization, which is really a matter of communication, it's a matter of being able to use a notation that actually describes this in a way that we can recognize that there's actually a problem, then what can we do with it? Well, I can use exactly the same notation to describe how I can fix this issue. So here I've got effectively the same thing, except I've got a proposed solution. Now, this is only one of a number of solutions. We use this as an example, something similar to this as a working example in a class. And the things that people do in a workshop, people are incredibly creative about coming up with different solutions, which, by the way, I think is partly because the notation is rich enough that they can see lots of different possibilities. So this is only one of them. In this particular solution to this problem, what we're describing in a very concise, simple, and really easily understandable way is that we're going to put in a customer service application specifically for supporting the call center. It consolidates information from existing services, and it kind of creates a single view that brings together a number of things that the call center agent would have had to bring together by themselves if they were doing this manually. And it performs the service of providing consolidated order information. And as a result of that, we can actually really eliminate a lot of the process steps in the business process. We can dramatically simplify the business process itself. We've taken a huge amount of the work and frankly, potential error out of the hands of the call center agent, automated some of that away, and created a mechanism that's much more effective for the call center, but most important, it's much more effective to the clients of the call center, the customers, because they're going to get the right answer, correct answers, much quicker. Now, being able to see that in a diagram is one thing. It's kind of, again, as you look at the diagram, it seems like, well, of course, that's a pretty clear solution. One of the benefits of this notation is these solutions that seem obvious, well, they're obvious in retrospect. They're obvious when we can draw them and describe them. And it's the ability to realize that the problem is there and realize that there are a number of different solutions and explore them and come up with a particular one, of which this is just one. That the support of the tools that allow us to do that, the notation that allows us to do that, really enables us to find these opportunities and reliably create these opportunities. And of course, I would never claim that somebody can't figure this out without ArchiMate. Of course they can. But here's the thing that it really helps with. A lot of the things that we do as an architect rely on us being able to have these realizations and have this understanding of a problem based on our kind of mental model of what a problem is like. If that mental model is driven by artifacts, diagrams, that are all very specialized and focus in on one particular aspect of it, our ability to be able to see that there's a kind of comprehensive picture, to pull all the pieces together. If the notation can't do that, we have to do that in our heads. And some people are really good at that. And some people, they really struggle with that. And even those of us who are really good at it, well, are we always going to be able to do it in a complex system? Are we going to be able to see that consolidated view? And if you think about the scenarios I described in the beginning, the problems, somebody's saying, I didn't understand that I was signing off on this. This is often why it happens, because we can't grasp the whole and see the connections easily. And that's part of the value of a tool like ArchiMate, a notation like ArchiMate, that helps us see these pieces as a whole. So how does it actually work? I've shown a number of examples. How does it actually work? Well, the way it works is to provide a mechanism for communicating clearly with meaning through pictures, diagrams. ArchiMate is effectively a grammar. I've been using the term notation. Strictly speaking, it's a grammar. And what a grammar is a way of organizing elements so that they have meaning. When I say Jack and Jill go up the hill as an English sentence, there's a grammar attached to that. The different parts of speech, they have particular roles in the grammar. And there are certain connections I can make between them that make sense. That particular combination of words makes sense to you, and you understand its meaning, not just because you understand the definition of each of the words, but you understand the rules of grammar. Maybe not explicitly, but implicitly, you understand the rules of grammar to construct those words together into meaningful sentences and understand the semantics of those. Well, that's the same idea as what ArchiMate does. ArchiMate is a grammar. The words are these elements, the symbols, and some of the connections between them. And there's a set of rules for how they connect together and what they mean. So the little diagram on the right side of the display, on the right side of the slide, is a grammatically correct sentence, if you will, in ArchiMate. And what it says is the lookup customer business service is realized by an application service, in other words, a thing an application does, that we're calling cust search. And that is implemented by a system, the CRM system. Now, that may sound like a very dry, dull, and boring sentence, and it is, but it's a meaningful sentence in the ArchiMate grammar. And that's significant because what ArchiMate tells us is it gives a collection of things that we can work with and a collection of connection rules for how to connect them together to be able to say meaningful things. So ArchiMate is made up of elements and relations. The elements are the things, the parts of our solution. And the relations are the way that they, well, relate to each other. They're how the parts fit together. So here's another grammatically correct sentence, if you will, in ArchiMate. And what this says is I have an application component, an application say, that's called Policy Manager. And it realizes a service, portfolio risk reporting. That means that there's a thing that it does that the outside world can make use of called portfolio risk reporting. And it accesses a data object, a hunk of data, called policy risk parameters. Now, Again, that on its own is not particularly interesting because it's a very short sentence like Jack and Jill went up the hill. But as part of an overall solution, it can be very specific and very meaningful in terms of what it conveys about the overall architecture. These elements and relations, they're the basic pieces that we put together to form a description of an overall solution. Those elements are divided up into a number of different categories or layers. And their business, their application, and their technology. They're differentiated by color so that we can visually see them easily on artifacts. And these different layers are used to divide the set of things that we think about into meaningful but distinct categories. Things in the business layer are about business, abstracted away from the pieces of technology that implement business. That's an important distinction, to be able to separate what happens in business from the tools and techniques that business makes use of. So, for example, we might have something in the business layer, a customer service business function. In other words, there's a business function that for providing customer service. And it's in the business layer, so it represents something that business does without necessarily binding us to any particular technology. We can expand in great detail exactly how it does, what the processes are, what the other supporting functions are. There's all kinds of things I can say about it in the business layer. But all of these kind of businessy things are all going to be grouped together as kind of one collection of elements. The next layer is the application layer, and it consists of those things where they're related to an actual application, something that's built with technology. So whereas we may have the customer service business function in the business layer, we have a CRM application in the application layer. And now it should be apparent that there's really a difference between these things. The CRM application is not the business process of customer service. It's an application. It is used for customer service, but it's not the same as customer service. Similarly, if I want to look at what business does, I shouldn't say, well, the customer service department is the CRM application. No, they're not. They make use of the CRM application. So I keep those things separate in different layers, and yet I can use them together in a single diagram. And the technology layer captures those things that are the underpinning technology, the things that applications are built on. So here, an example might be a mail gateway. It might be a common shared service the CRM makes use of for sending email blasts. Now, if you look at this set of layers and the kind of different ways that we divide elements up in ArchiMate, we have business, application, and technology, and that may seem very similar to the TOGAF model, where we have business, application, technology, and data, or business, application, information, and technology. In ArchiMate, information is actually an aspect of each of these layers. This is a really interesting twist that ArchiMate introduces into this concept of information, because we draw a distinction between information that's part of business and information that's part of an application. And the way we draw that distinction is we think of information in business as being those abstract concepts that business manipulates. So in our customer service environment, one of the pieces of business information may be potential customers. Now, in ArchiMate, this is just a single symbol. I can put some documentation behind it and describe it. But the thing it represents in the business layer is the concept of potential customers. Those potential customers might actually be realized by data inside an application. In the application layer, we have a data object, prospects in CRM. What that data object represents is prospect information that's stored inside the CRM system or used by the CRM system. And because it's in the application layer, this corresponds to data. It's something that would exist in a machine. It could be in memory or on disk, or it's something that's machine readable. And this is a really powerful idea. This is, in some senses, much more powerful than trying to say there's an information layer that's separate. Because what it lets us do is keep information and show the aspects of information directly as how they relate to the applications and directly how they relate to business and most importantly, how they relate to each other. So I can show that the business concept of potential customers is actually realized by the data or made real by the data that's sitting inside CRM, which may seem like an obvious thing, but it's able to allow us to connect those two worlds and most importantly, be able to show what the similarities and differences between those two worlds are. Because it could easily be that in business, our idea of potential customers is slightly different or maybe more general than what we actually store inside a CRM system. And with this, I can actually discover that and show it. And of course, there's a similar concept in the technology layer. The green box that looks like a little piece of paper with a dog-eared corner represents a piece of information in technology, which was generally a file or some particular artifact, something which is a real kind of physically realizable thing. Excuse me. And our ability to express that as a separate kind of thing really helps us to be able to call out things like there's a kind of direct connection from how business thinks about potential customers through how it's managed inside an application into a particular thing that gets sent over to, say, a marketing firm for an email blast. And that's why information is not a separate domain. It's actually much more powerful than that. But in ArchiMate, we also, there we go, lost my cursor for a minute. We have more than just business application and technology. We met some things from the strategy layer already. Strategy describes what we want to do. And if you think about this as a kind of extension to what we normally model, there's a whole collection of capabilities I have to model the way I want to act as an organization or why I want to do something, or what capability I want to build up. I can actually have that as part of my overall model. That's kind of different from a lot of notations where I have something specialized about business or something specialized about application or various aspects of the technical implementation of an application. I also have a section for motivation. Motivation are elements, symbols that let me describe interesting things like why I want to do something or make a comment about something or put in a constraint or even put in things like why we're doing something because we're being influenced by a competitive threat or whatever it happens to be. And this ability to describe how we do things and why we do things isn't just some nice to have abstract thing. It actually dramatically deepens our ability to describe the motivation behind something, the kind of reason for doing something. That since that's part of the model and it becomes part of something that we kind of carry through our whole design, if you will, it really tells people, stakeholders, technical people, approvers, implementers, it really helps them understand why they do the things they do with our design. And I can't overestimate the impact of that in your ability to communicate and motivate and bring into alignment different parts of the organization around a solution. And lastly, there's a layer that has a number of elements around implementation, which is essentially about how we manage change. So in my notation, not only can I describe the architecture of a solution, spanning business application and technology, and say why we're doing it and our strategy for meeting particular goals, but I can also deal with issues about how I'm actually going to implement this. Things like a plateau where I've implemented a system as an intermediary for a period of time. So we have these collections of capabilities of things that we're able to describe that give me the chance to talk about a few of these views in a little bit more detail, just to give you a taste for some of the kind of standard ways that we often use this notation. We can use it, for example, to describe process. So here's the process view that we had before, and I can describe processes in arbitrary levels of detail. It doesn't have all the fine details of BPMN for capturing the nuances of a process, but it has all the things that I need to be able to describe a process at the level that of detail that I'm typically going to use for kind of describing an overall business architecture or part of a business architecture, and then link that, to other things. I can also describe my application landscape. Now, this view is extremely small. A real application landscape is going to be much bigger than this, and would generally have connections between um, separate applications to show their dependencies. So we can describe the overall application landscape of an organization or part of an organization or a division in terms of what are the things that are available in my landscape, and with service realization, what do they actually do? What services do they provide to their consumers? And by the way, a service, an application service, doesn't mean an API. It could be an API, but it's more abstract than that. It's something that the application does for users of the application. So for order management, this view orders service, it could be an API. It could be a web page. It could be, I mean, the wording doesn't make it sound like it, but it could be, I guess, could be reports that get printed. In other words, the notation gives us a lot of leeway in kind of being able to describe what it is that the thing is. There are other parts of the notation which I haven't shown here that would let us be as specific as we want. If I really want to show the fact that, for example, view orders has an API and is also a web page, I can show that. Chose not to. But the notation gives me the tools to be able to do that. A common theme in a lot of the things that we do in ArchiMate, and you've seen this in the kind of setup to this point already, is combining some of these different layers together to show the connections between them. That's the ArchiMate secret sauce. So service usage shows what business things actually make use of the services. And I can look at this from the point of view of business and say, what are the different services that I make use of? How do they contribute to the overall business process? To connect what business needs to do or wants to do or maybe does or maybe doesn't do yet to what we need to be able to have in the application layer. And of course, connect that to what the actual applications. So where what services the applications provide, and therefore start to connect right through from the business all into what all of the applications that support a business process are. And again, this gives us the opportunity to be able to look for changes, either to see that maybe I need to make some application changes or add applications, and these views will help me be able to make good decisions about that. What's the trade-off between modifying some existing applications or creating a new intermediary? So hopefully this has been some motivation for why ArchiMate. Let's just assume, optimistically, that you're motivated to look further into ArchiMate. What would be next? What are the things that we would do to add ArchiMate to our toolbox? Well, the first part of this would be to think, well, what's next in adding ArchiMate as one of the multiple things that I have that I make use of as an architect? And its place in the toolbox, it's the things that it's good at, is really being able to have a single notation that allows us to show the whole picture in one model. The tools that we have now, the tools that we're used to, are generally specialist notations like UML and entity relationship diagrams and business process model notation, BPMN diagrams. Now, these are great tools. We're not going to replace them. But these tools, they're very specialized. They give us a tremendous amount of ability to dive into detail about a particular subject area, like an ERD with a data model. But they're narrow. An ERD focuses on data. It doesn't deal with a lot of other things. What ArchiMate lets us do is have a broader and more comprehensive view of a solution, the different aspects of a solution in a single model. ArchiMate is really good at showing the relationship between different domains. Business, information, application, and technology are all modeled together, along with the reason why we do things, strategy and motivation. And this comprehensive picture helps us really understand the relationship between the domains, those connections. And it's in those connections that drives good decisions and helps us recognize good opportunities. In our toolbox, we should expect that ArchiMate is complementary to other notations, not a replacement. It's more general than the specialized notations and helps drive seeing the big picture. But having the big picture isn't everything. It's critically important. But once we've got that big picture, we also use the specialized notations to show the details when they're needed. Now, what do you need to make use of ArchiMate effectively? Well, nothing really. As a notation, what ArchiMate really is a set of symbols for the elements, a set of rules for what they mean and how they connect together. And, well, frankly, that's kind of it. So I can use ArchiMate very effectively just on a whiteboard or using a general drawing tool like Lucidchart. And, every kind of really good diagramming tool these days has ArchiMate templates available for it. So you could turn around tomorrow and make use of ArchiMate and the power of ArchiMate simply by drawing the symbols. Fortunately, modeling tools tend to have really good support from ArchiMate as well. There's a tool that I use that quite often, it's on the slide, it's Archie. It's at archimatetool.com. It's based on Eclipse, and it's a free open source modeling tool, which is actually surprisingly powerful for, a free and open source tool. And it's really quite approachable, which is one of the things I like about it. I've actually used it in front of clients who've kind of gone ooh-ah and picked it up and started using it themselves. It's that accessible. And it's suitable for small to mid-sized models. It's not really suitable for sharing. It's not a tool that really is suitable for collaboration between multiple people, but it's great as an individual practitioner. And if you want a way of even just playing with ArchiMate a little bit more and seeing it through the eyes of a real modeling tool, this is a great choice because it runs on everything. So it's written in Java, so it'll run on Linux, Mac, Windows, and it works quite well. But of course, the real commercial tools, things like Sparks, Enterprise Architecture, Mega, they all kind of have the support for ArchiMate as well. Now, of course, using the tools kind of requires that you have the knowledge of the ArchiMate grammar and actually how to use it. And of course, this being our webinar, we're going to plug a resource that WebAge has. And we have this course, ArchiMate for Architects, which is a 2-day comprehensive look at the ArchiMate notation and common uses in business and application architecture. It introduces a lot of the foundations of ArchiMate and the use cases around business application and technology layers with a focus on business and application. And has a fair bit of workshop content to really try and help people practice developing some ArchiMate artifacts based on either scenarios that they develop themselves, things that they want to tackle, or a realistic business scenario that's been laid out in the course. And this doesn't require any particular tooling or any prior knowledge of ArchiMate. Of course, there are other routes to ArchiMate mastery. There is actually a lot of material that's just publicly available. This ArchiMate standards is actually a pretty good reference source. So there are lots of places to get to dip your toes in. If you're looking for that real kind of comprehensive boot camp, I'm going to walk out afterwards and be able to actually be productive right away with ArchiMate. Our 2-day ArchiMate for ArchiMate architects is aimed at exactly that. Now, I hope I've given you some good motivation for ArchiMate, a introductory understanding of what it is, what it looks like. Let me open the floor in the bit of time we have remaining for any questions, comments, anything that people would be interested in. I'm going to unmute everybody. See if this works. Well, oh, I think you have to unmute yourself if you want to speak. Please enter a question in chat if you have a question or comment, and or speak up. I'm happy to address any questions or comments that anybody has. I've been so good at describing ArchiMate that everybody's enthused and knows what they're going to do next. For those of you who joined a little bit later, a recording of the webinar will be provided a little bit later. And again, questions, I think, just a question? Yes, Bernie, please.
Yeah, briefly, where do you, for existing companies that have an architectural practice with a business, how do you see this typically being introduced? What is sort of the precipitating situation, and how does it come to a happy ending?
So, so first of all, I see ArchiMate being introduced only in situations where there's an existing architectural practice, simply because, you know, if you're just starting out in architecture, I mean, I guess you could be picking up ArchiMate as well. The people that we deal with and the people that we see in courses are practicing architects with existing practices inside an organization. They're adding it as another tool. And the motivation that we hear most often is a need to be able to have better communication particularly with business, but across stakeholders in general. But we do hear particularly with business. We see organizations that don't have standards for what their artifacts are. They may have tools, but they don't necessarily, they haven't standardized yet on what diagramming techniques they use. And so it's a little bit ad hoc. And so one of the things that some organizations seem to be doing is saying, well, because ArchiMate can handle a number of different scenarios inside architecture, it can be used by a number of different kinds of specialists, kinds of roles. That's the notation that we're going to go with. What seems to be happening in the industry is there's a broadening awareness of and acceptance of ArchiMate. And so in many cases, what we see is organizations who are simply saying, oh, we've realized that this thing exists and that maybe some people are using it ad hoc inside the organization. And they want to kind of broaden the benefits of that across the organization.
Thank you. Can I ask a follow-on?
Of course.
So I'm thinking of some large healthcare organizations near where I live that have extensive architectural practices, and I'm sure the business is knowledgeable about their business, but confused about how the requirements get transformed into solutions. So it seems like this would be a pretty natural way to clarify the discussions on a high level. And but I'm always wondering who pushes that ball forward a little bit. Is it the business saying, yeah, this is kind of confusing, could you make this a little easier, or the architects themselves band together and say, boy, we really need to get on the same page here with the business, let's propose this? So I'm kind of wondering like which direction this comes from. And that's to sort of flesh out my first question.
Yeah, so at least in the case of ArchiMate, every adoption of ArchiMate I've seen has been driven by architects. Business may be in a position where we're saying, you know, we need better communication, but they're not really in a position to suggest how that happens. Whereas the architecture teams will typically be looking for, you know, how can we communicate better? So it comes from them, and it's interesting that the particular case that you're describing, because one of our big clients who's actually doing an ArchiMate rollout is actually a large healthcare firm in the Midwest.
Thank you. Perhaps this is exactly on point.
Well, you'll get follow up and hopefully you'll explore that further because yeah, I think one-on-one we could describe. We'd be happy to describe specific use cases and things that we're seeing with clients.
Thank you.
Any other questions, comments? Well, I do want to thank you very much for your time. We managed to end just before 1, which I'm sure is good for everybody. So uh, really appreciate you taking the time with us. You will get a follow-up with a copy of the recording. So I know a number of people weren't able to join right on time. So you'll get the whole recording. And I do hope that I have the opportunity to see some of you in one of our classes. Thank you so much. And do feel free to follow up offline if there's something that you want to do that you want to follow up on more one-on-one. Thank you, and have a great day.